SNP's policy of gender self-ID has now been ruled to be unlawful by our highest court. SNP politicians, including Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney, were willing to trash women's rights while pushing their dangerous and divisive ideology. Common sense and a basic respect for biological truth have now prevailed thanks to the incredible Scottish women who would not wish. The SNP's fringe obsession has cost obscene amounts of taxpayers' money and wasted huge amounts of government time while public services were neglected. Politicians have a duty to hold up their hands and admit their mistakes. So will John Swinney finally apologise to the women of Scotland?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government accepts the judgment of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that women in the Equality Act 2010 is defined by biological sex, and the Government accepts that ruling. I also accept that the Court emphasised that this decision does not reduce trans people's protections from discrimination, whether or not they have a gender recognition certificate. The Equality Act expressly prohibits discrimination and harassment against trans people, and it's not necessary to have a GRC in order to be protected. I believe the vast majority of people in Scotland want to live in a country that is respectful, compassionate and caring, and I'm committed to protecting the rights of all, and that will guide all of my actions as First Minister.
Russell Finlay.
For John Swinney, it seems that sorry really is the hardest word to say. And we know why, because he's not sorry. The SNP still believes in gender self-ID. 2 months ago, John Swinney said that he accepts that trans women are women. Yesterday, he dodged the same question and he said there will be plenty of opportunities for that. Well, here's his opportunity. Are trans women women? The court ruling makes this clear, and as a result, Scotland's public bodies must now abandon SNP gender policies and respect the rule of law. For the country to move on and for trust to be rebuilt, it's important for the Government to accept accountability and to own its mistakes. So will John Swinney at least now admit that he got this so very wrong?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, as the Supreme Court judgment narrates, there is a complex reconciliation of two pieces of legislation that the Scottish Government is obliged to work within. And those are the Gender Recognition Act 2004 and the Equality Act 2010. Now, I remind Russell Finlay that on two occasions, the Scottish Government's legislation that was passed in 2018, which was the subject of the legal challenge, was supported by decisions taken in courts in Scotland. Now, that was not the case in the Supreme Court judgment, and I accept unreservedly the Supreme Court judgment. As Mr Finlay knows, I am a believer in the rule of law. Therefore, the Government will take the steps. The Government will take the steps, as the Social Justice Secretary set out to Parliament on Tuesday, to make sure that all of the regulatory changes that are required to be made in the light of the decision of the Supreme Court are made, and we will draw, as we did on the previous guidance, on the input of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, as the Government is obliged to do, given they are the regulators of the Equality Act 2010.
Russell Finlay.
We spent years telling the SNP to drop this nonsense and get back to the day job. They refused to listen. They were absolutely obsessed. Now John Swinney doesn't want to talk about it because mainstream Scotland has turned against him. And the harms caused by gender self-ID are real. Female prisoners were the first target of SNP gender ideology. And today, a prison officer told me that staff still face disciplinary action if they call male sex offenders identifying as female he or him. Now, following the scandal of a rapist in a women's prison, there are still male prisoners in the female estate, and that's despite last week's seismic court ruling. So will John Swinney now instruct the Scottish Prison Service to ensure male prisoners do their time in men's prisons?
First Minister.
As the Government has set out to Parliament already, we are considering the details of the Supreme Court judgment taking the necessary advice from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission about the application of that advice, and that will have a bearing on the judgments that are made in relation to public services. And I will expect, as is, I think, well established in our politics and our discourse, all public bodies, including the Scottish Prison Service, to operate on that basis and within the law.
Russell Finley.
That's just a typically weak and evasive response. The SNP's focus on radical gender ideology hasn't just impacted in prisons, it has damaged trust in politics. It showed Holyrood had lost the plot and Nicola Sturgeon was detached from reality. John Swinney has got a chance to be his own man and go a different way from his closest ally, who isn't even showing up at work anymore. He could guarantee all public bodies will have new and lawful policies to respect women's rights in place by summer. He could be honest and admit that trans women are not women. He could hold his hands up and apologise fully and sincerely. John Swinney could ditch Nicola Sturgeon's toxic legacy once and for all. Will he now take the chance to finally bring to the end the era of divisive gender politics?
First Minister.
President, so in one of Mr Finley's earlier questions, he said to me the Conservatives had been warning about all of this for years. I want to read to Parliament the comments made by Alison Harris, who was a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Conservatives in the last Parliament, on Tuesday the 30th of January 2018.
Members.
And from the official report to Parliament, Alison Harris said this: "As a member of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee, Annie Wells was pleased to see positive changes being made at Stage 2 to the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Bill. In particular, she was pleased to see the committee agree to Mary Fee's Amendment 10, which sought to broaden the definition of woman so that the legislation should be inclusive as possible, recognising that not all trans women possess..."
Members.
Recognising that not all trans women possess a gender recognition certificate. I simply read that into the official report to show that the
Members, I'm very keen that as many members are able to take part in this session as possible, and if we could ensure that we could hear one another, that would be helpful.
I'm simply reading that into the official report because the Conservatives have changed their position on this, and they have changed their position from what they said in 2018. What my government will do, Presiding Officer, is my government will do what it always does: follow the rule of law, take careful account of the decisions and the context in which we take our decisions, and act wisely to protect the rights of all within Scotland, because the first duty of the government is to protect the rights of everyone in Scottish society.